Welcome, everybody. I hope you all can hear me. Okay. Is this clear? Wonderful. So thank you all for joining us for this wonderful event, a CMES book talk. It really gives me great pleasure to have been invited to both introduce my dear friend and colleague, Mayte Green Mercado, as well as to be part of the conversation. I'm really looking forward to this, and I'm really glad all of you can join us. Looking forward to hearing all your thoughts, questions, etc. I'm sure Mayte is as well. So to get into it, I want to first introduce Professor Green Mercado. So Mayte Green Mercado is an associate professor of history at Rutgers University in Newark, and the director of the Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies minor in the Department of History. At Rutgers, she teaches courses on Islamic civilization, the history of Al-Andalus, the medieval and early modern Mediterranean, as well as courses on migration and displacement in the Mediterranean. She's published articles on early modern apocalypticism in the Mediterranean, Morisco apocalypticism in particular, the conversion of Iberian Muslims, of Spanish and Portuguese Muslims, as well as race and ethnicity in early modern Spain. Her current book project traces the history of Morisco migration in the Mediterranean in the pre-expulsion period, that is, before the 17th century. She's founder and co-director of the very exciting Mediterranean Displacements Project at Rutgers Newark, and she also serves on the boards of the Mediterranean Seminar and the Spain North Africa Project. And she's a steering committee member for the working group Race in the Pre-Modern World at Rutgers University. And most importantly, she is an alum of both CMES and NELC at the University of Chicago, where we first met. So without further ado, I would like to invite Mayte to start talking a little bit about her book, Visions of Deliverance, Moriscos and the Politics of Prophecy in the Early Modern Mediterranean. Welcome, Mayte. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm so excited to see so many familiar faces. I feel like I'm with my family right now, and this is really exciting. And as Mohammed mentioned, this book started as a dissertation that I wrote in NELC under the direction of Professor Cornel Fleischer. And so it's really an honor for me to be able to share this work with you all and to talk about it here today. And I want to thank the Center for Middle Eastern Studies for hosting this event, Professor Orit Bashkin and Tom McGuire for the invitation, and also to Mohammed for facilitating today's discussion. I really do feel like I'm at home today, and this is wonderful. So I prepared a talk about my book just so I can stay in the allotted time. I'm going to share my screen really quickly to give you first an overview of very broad strokes of Morisco history and what the book is about. Can you see my screen? Okay, so let me see. Okay, I have to say that this cover for my book was prepared by my wonderful husband, Javier Castro. And it's, to me, a very, very beautiful cover. So I'm very excited to share it with you today. So one of the central aims of my book has been to offer a novel perspective on Moriscos who, as you may know, were Iberian Muslims forcibly converted to Catholicism in the first 2 decades of the 16th century as part of the Spanish authorities' attempt to make their growing empire into a homogeneously Catholic monarchy. Subsequently, Moriscos faced not only an inordinate pressure by the political and religious authorities, most famously the Inquisition, but also a great deal of discrimination by the so-called old Christians, as opposed to the new Christians, which Moriscos were called. Within that dire context, some Moriscos came to embrace Christianity, and others continued to cultivate a Muslim identity in private while outwardly professing the Catholic faith. And it is this latter group that my book focuses on. The book is my attempt to reconstruct these Moriscos' political thought and practices by tracing the circulation and dissemination of apocalyptic ideas, and more specifically, of apocalyptic texts known as Hofores from the Arabic Jafr, which predicted the re-establishment of Islam in its communal and political dimensions in the Iberian Peninsula, presumably before the end of times. The degrees of acculturation of Moriscos to Christian society and their knowledge of the Catholic faith varied between the different communities dispersed throughout the peninsula. And this had to do with geography and with history, and also with inconsistent efforts at evangelization in the different kingdoms at different moments. What this meant was that while some Moriscos had lost their knowledge of the Arabic language, for example, in areas of Castile and Aragon, after having lived for centuries side by side with Christians, others continued to speak Arabic well into the mid-16th century, like the Moriscos of Granada, who had lived in a Muslim kingdom until fairly recently. And as you remember, Granada was conquered in 1492. Or those of Valencia, many of whom lived in rural communities separated from their Christian counterparts. The sincerity of those conversions was called into question early on. This is the context of chapter 1 of the book, which offers a case study of a young Morisco visionary who was able to amass a small movement among the communities of Avila and Arevalo, and you can see it here on the map in Castile, in mid-1530s, 1540s, and early 1540s. Here, I analyzed several inquisitorial records of Moriscos close to the young seer to reveal tensions within different groups who not only tried to define the boy's visionary career, but whose efforts also centered on defining a Muslim identity for their immediate community. As I argue, this was not simply an effort to revive Islam, but an expression of a discrete Castilian interpretation of Islam. The efforts on the part of the civil and ecclesiastical authorities to assess, define, and control Morisco culture peaked in the 1560s with the Pragmatic of 1567, promulgated by King Philip II, which banned the use of the Arabic language in oral and written form, Morisco dress, music and festivities, baths, among many others. Chapter 2 centers on the different Morisco responses to this royal encroachment and the political discourses that were aimed at mobilizing Moriscos in Granada to resist these violent measures. The context of this is what came to be known as the Alpujarras Revolt, a 2-year insurrection that culminated in the enslavement of the rebels and the expulsion of Moriscos from the Kingdom of Granada and their dispersal throughout the Iberian Peninsula. In this context, and in an attempt to mobilize the Granadan Moriscos into revolt, certain Morisco elites deployed an apocalyptic discourse that was articulated in a martyrological language and that promised a future redemption in this world and in the hereafter. The subsequent chapters showed that the experience of Granada served as blueprint for the civil and ecclesiastical authorities when attempting to discern Morisco political activities. I should stress here that the pressure and intense surveillance carried out by the inquisitorial authorities after the Alpujarras revolt provoked what I end up discussing throughout the book. The numbers of Moriscos in Valencia and Aragon detained and tried by the inquisitorial authorities soared after the Alpujarras revolt. Facing this untenable situation, some Morisco elites opted to resist these pressures in open revolt. And the Alpujarras experience served as a model for those Moriscos in other kingdoms who held political aspirations. The question of Morisco conspiracies was constant in the minds of the religious and royal authorities and after the Alpujarras revolt, and it served as justification for the eventual expulsion of Moriscos that took place in 1609. It is for this reason that scholars today remain suspicious of these conspiracies, so much so that they cast rebellion attempts as inquisitorial paranoias. Here, I should pause and talk a little bit about how I came to this project. I came to the subject of Morisco apocalypticism through the work of literary scholars like Luce Lopez Baralt, my compatriot, fellow Puerto Rican, who read these Morisco prognostications as reflections of a Morisco identity in decline. As such, these texts chronicled the destruction of Morisco culture, and they served as consolatory texts for Moriscos who mourned the death of their communities. Let me show you some example of these Morisco texts. These texts are drawn from Islamic and Christian apocalyptic lore, which was adapted to the concerns of Iberian Muslim and Morisco communities in the 15th and 16th centuries. Some of these texts are written in what is known as Aljamiado, and here you have an example. And this is the rendering of Romance languages in Arabic characters. So let me give you an example of how this works here. Here we have a prophecy attributed to Saint Isidore of Seville, and it is written in Arabic characters in Spanish. And this is another sample of the material that I work with. But we also find these texts written in Arabic. And here we have an example of a copy that was appended to an Inquisition record of a Morisco. So at times we find these sources written in Arabic in inquisitorial material. When the inquisitors went to detain a suspect, they tried to gather information, and we find, fortunately, material like this. And finally, we also have the translation into Spanish of some of these Arabic texts that were circulating during the revolt of the Alpujarras. And these translations were made by a Morisco royal interpreter and translator. His name was Alonso del Castillo, who translated these texts after the rebellion. So when the rebellion ended, and the Inquisition came and was investigating the revolt, they impounded letters and also other papers, some of which were these apocalyptic texts. And so Alonso del Castillo, who was a Morisco, served as the translator. And Alonso del Castillo shared these texts with a Christian chronicler, with Luis de Manuel Carvajal, who took these translations and published them in his chronicle of the revolt, Historia de Rebelión y Castigo, which was published in 1600. So let me go back to the project itself. So I mentioned that I was inspired by these interpretations of literary scholars. And I sought, after reading these really beautiful this beautiful scholarship on these Jofores, I sought to understand the contexts in which these texts circulated. I wanted to know if these texts indeed circulated at all, under which circumstances, and for which purposes. As I researched the circulation of these texts, I came to realize that these were not simply consolatory texts that chronicled an isolated community in decline. On the contrary, I realized that these were texts produced by a very active community, and that they codified what I call a particular Morisco political theology that responded to a clear understanding of the volatile and fluid political life of inter-imperial competition in the Mediterranean. My research led me through very similar paths as those of the inquisitors. And indeed, I relied on Inquisition sources, which I read alongside these Morisco texts while trying to understand how and when they were read by Moriscos. Scholars have already warned about the perils of using Inquisition sources to study Morisco history. And they particularly centered on the question of Morisco conspiracies as proofs for the unreliability of Inquisition sources for this type of study. But reading these Inquisition sources alongside Morisco sources allowed me to hear the voices of Moriscos repeating the information that was contained in these prognosticative texts. In an effort to overcome the challenges posed by the bias in Inquisition sources, I decided to incorporate other material. In this case, non-Inquisition sources, and I used, for example, diplomatic correspondence, chronicles, and the like, and also non-Iberian material. So I used diplomatic correspondence from France and from Italy, but also texts produced in North Africa and also material produced in the Ottoman Empire. And what I was looking for was to corroborate some of the information contained in both the Morisco texts and in the inquisitorial material. That's what I dedicated the remaining chapters of the book, chapters 3 to 6, to doing. This documentary shift was accompanied by a methodological shift and a shift in framing. And I will explain a little bit what I mean by this. So chapters 1 and 2, as I just explained, were anchored in the Iberian Peninsula, and they centered for the most part, though not entirely, on sources that were produced in the Iberian Peninsula, mostly Inquisition sources and chronicles and the like. The methodological framework of these two chapters is very much microhistorical. So one of them deals with an Inquisition case and the other one a case study of a particular rebellion. The theater of actions of chapters 3 to 6 widens the frame to the Mediterranean to reveal the movement of ideas as well as connections and interactions of Moriscos across the sea. The methodological approach of these chapters oscillates from connected histories, and here I'm very much influenced by the work of Sanjay Subrahmanian and of course of my own dissertation advisor, Cornel Fleischer, and it moves from connected histories to microhistories to back to examining the connections across the Mediterranean. Chapter 3, for example, traces a particular apocalyptic reference drawn from an Inquisition source across the Mediterranean to Venice and to Istanbul. Chapter 4 traces the contacts and connections of certain Morisco elites from Aragon and Valencia who attempted to establish contacts with the Ottomans as they planned a new rebellion. As I argue in these chapters and throughout the book, the study of the circulation of Morisco apocalyptic texts not only reveals the specific contexts in which these ideas peaked, and this was for the most part during moments when Moriscos were attempting to engage in political activities and mobilizing the community, but they offer valuable insights into Morisco political culture. As chapters 4 and 6 show, this political culture was very much informed by and in conversation with the broader Islamic and Mediterranean worlds. In chapter 6, for example, I examine Morisco communications with Henry IV of France. By employing a connected Mediterranean framework, in this book, I have tried to contextualize Morisco apocalyptic texts and political strategies. By combining a Mediterranean and a connected histories framework, I attempted to demonstrate that Morisco apocalyptic ideas were part of a broader Mediterranean intellectual, cultural, and political shift that began in the 15th century and that sought to articulate political ideas of universal rule through messianic and apocalyptic idioms. Many Moriscos were abreast of news regarding Ottoman defeats and victories, and like many of their Christian and Muslim contemporaries, they interpreted historical events in an apocalyptic key. The circulation of Jofores was not merely a local phenomenon, that is, an Iberian phenomenon, as it had previously been understood. Rather, as I try to show in my book, Moriscos were well aware of the broader dimensions and implications of apocalyptic claims in the Ottoman Habsburg competition for the control of the Mediterranean, and they attempted to leverage it to their advantage. To conclude, by relocating Moriscos from a traditional limiting Iberian framework in favor of a Mediterranean frame, I have attempted to draw a more nuanced, complex, and richer picture of Moriscos as political actors on a Mediterranean stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maite, for that very wonderful presentation. It's really difficult to summarize such a deep and sort of kind of comprehensive book in 15 minutes, but I think you did a wonderful job of doing that. So I wanted to just kind of maybe bring out a little bit more of the themes that you started talking about towards the end. I do think this is a really important contribution to our understanding of the early modern Mediterranean, especially in the ways that it challenges conventional periodizations and sort of geographies and sort of artificial demarcations of space, right? So just as many scholars have long shown, that the Ottoman Empire was part of the history of early modern Europe, you're showing that the Moriscos are also part of the history of the Islamic world and should be incorporated back into the Islamic world, as they so actively sought to do, right? And as they were participating in. You've also demonstrated the productivity of employing the Mediterranean as a frame to demonstrate the importance of things like diplomacy, exchange, networks, traditions of sovereignty across confessional and geographic and cultural boundaries, right? So it really brings us very close to notions of the global, I think. And not in an artificial or ideological way, but simply in terms of these people moved around and ideas moved around, right? And this is, I think, one of the biggest accomplishments of this book. And as you can see, anyone who reads this book and just looks at the footnotes, you yourself were quite a traveler. I mean, you went from archive to archive, piecing together the story, which I think maybe even helped you think a little bit like your sources, right? How these people were themselves mobile. They were itinerant. They were not static. They were not stable, just like their identities were not static or stable. And that's the biggest kind of takeaway I took from the book. These people, these Moriscos, were not just passive sort of victims of either sort of Ottoman, expansion or Castilian policies. They were agents in that history who sought to transform their situation, and in turn ended up transforming the policies of those empires and affecting the policies of those empires, which I think is really important to consider. So you get us very, very close to social history here, right? And I think using the inquisitorial archive productively is not an easy thing to do, and is it's a minefield historiographically. And I think you've navigated it pretty well. I really just wanted to highlight those aspects of the book because I think you really brought sort of this out very well in the book, which is extremely readable. I have to say, it's not easy to make this stuff readable. And I also appreciated the appendix, which for anyone interested in the apocalyptic angle in particular, translates all these prophecies, which I think is really, really important. And I never expected to see both Henry IV of France and Suleiman the Magnificent being depicted as messiahs. But that's precisely what these Moriscos did, right? They allied with everything from Protestants to Ottoman sort of emperors, basically, and rulers. Like, this is how complicated and sort of interesting this world is that you've reconstructed for us. One other thing that I was hoping you can speak more about before we turn it over to the Q&A is how these Moriscos, in addition to agency and resistance, which I think is a thread that you've talked about pretty much at this pretty well at this point, but the participation, how the Morisco question reflects the participation of these people in broader developments in the history of both early modern Europe and the Islamic world, including things like confessionalization, right? Reformation, right? And more particularly, the question of religious toleration, right? I mean, this is I know I'm speaking to a CMES and MELC audience here, but I'm interested to know what you think of how the Morisco question can better illuminate our understanding of these questions. And I think that's sort of, I'll leave it there. I have so many more questions, but I'll leave it there for now, and maybe I'll come back with a few others. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mohammed. I am so excited again that you are responding to my work, and I really appreciate your comments. where to start with this question of the Morisco question. So already after the moment of the forced conversions, Christians were grappling in the Christian and royal authorities were grappling with the question of whether these conversions were valid and whether these conversions were real. That is, whether Moriscos had sincerely converted to Christianity. And as I mentioned before, some Moriscos actually did. And the core of the question was whether, because of this forced conversion, Moriscos were assimilable, whether Moriscos could assimilate and really become part of the Christian fold. And this was something that the authorities were grappling with at the time, and that there is no simple, single answer to this. As I mentioned before, there were Moriscos who converted and were in the transition towards assimilation, and there were others who resisted. So one of the things that I've tried to do in this book is to really make sure that I am presenting an accurate picture of the diversity of the Morisco experience. And while I decided very consciously to focus on those Moriscos who identified as Muslims, even if in secret, or that we can talk about them as crypto-Muslims, we can't talk about one Morisco, that we need to talk about many experiences of Moriscos, right? And so this Morisco question continues to shape the scholarship today and debates about how to talk about Moriscos and view the Moriscos. So I have received some pushback because of my interest in focusing on these crypto Muslim Moriscos, because I think some scholars feel like I am reifying the anti-Morisco notions that the Catholic authorities, in particular the Inquisition, had as fifth columns of the Ottoman Empire, as bad Christians, as crypto-Muslims, etc. But one of the things that I was trying to do was precisely to recover those voices and that agency of these Moriscos who identified as crypto-Muslims. And this, of course, comes from my training in the Department of Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations there in Chicago. And so I think that the direction that this whole project took is very much influenced by the training that I received in Chicago, and that without the on the one hand, without the experience of having sort of been the black sheep in a department like NELC, because I wasn't really studying Ottoman history or the Central Islamic lands, or so my topic was sort of at the margins of what we consider the history of Islamic civilization. That forced me to have to engage with my colleagues there. And of course, I was fortunate enough to receive training in a very broad way, like the training that we receive in Chicago. And that took me outside of the Iberian Peninsula and started making me look to connections. And that's where the Connected Histories project comes into being. But I'm going to stop because there are more questions and I want to hear those questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Maite. Because I think in the book, Maite, you actually point to discourses about Ottoman toleration as structuring both critiques of the Moriscos and critiques of the Spanish state. By not only by Moriscos, but sometimes these inquisitors are using those critiques for their own purposes.
Exactly.
Deploy them against the state, and nobles use them too all the time. So yeah, it's fascinating to see the interplay there between these two concepts. And I do want to add, before I get to Kave's question, one quick thing is this is all happening as Spain becomes one of the world's most multicultural empires, right? So it's interesting to look at the interplay between overseas expansion and what's happening in Spain. And this is talked about a lot in these inquisitorial and theological kind of discourses, right? Like, so I don't know if you want to say anything to that.
Yeah, it's actually quite interesting because on the one hand, and I just last week, as part of the group that I'm in on that works on race in the pre-modern world, we organized a conference that was just like a really, really interesting conference where I kept hearing all of these papers on the Philippines and on the Americas and on processes of racialization. And it kept bringing me back to the Moriscos, and I just kept asking the same question. So not only did the Morisco, and of course the experience with Jews and conversos sort of serve as blueprint for for the treatment of other groups outside of the Iberian Peninsula, but that at the time they are making these references. The ecclesiastical and royal authorities are referencing the experiences in the Iberian Peninsula as guides to manage the situation in other places. So yeah.
Mike, did you have time for one more question? One last question?
I do, yes.
Great. So Amina is asking, she says, thank you so much for a great talk. Can you speak a little more about any connections between Morisco or crypto-Muslim apocalypticism and larger Christian or Catholic apocalypticism at the time, especially thinking about the expansion into the New World?
Expansion of the New World. It's actually a good question. It's a great question because one of the things that we see is that the Morisco, the texts, the Aljamiado texts, apocalyptic texts that the Moriscos are adapting from Christian apocalyptic lore have a very similar background. Okay, so to apocalyptic prophecies, for example, I'm thinking of Columbus's Book of Prophecies, right? And so these were very much influenced by the prophecies of Pierre Dailly, and they were based on, or at least influenced by, prophecies of Pseudo-Methodius. And so what we see is that Moriscos, the implication is that the Moriscos are aware of these apocalyptic texts, that they have access to them, and that they are able to adapt them to their own particular communal concerns. So if we're going to look at the apocalyptic corpus of Moriscos, what we're talking about is about 8 or 9 texts, right? And I would say that 3 or 4 of them, and I'm here kind of, I can't remember as specifically, but 3 or 4 of them are adaptations of Christian texts, and the rest are adaptations of prophetic hadiths, okay? And so there is a clear connection. And the other thing that I should say is that Christians were very much aware that Moriscos had these prophecies, and that they circulated these prophecies, and the contexts in which they circulated these prophecies. And so, for example, one of the chronicles of the expulsion, that is basically a celebration and support of the expulsion of the Moriscos in 1609, talks about how the Moriscos knew about and had read the prophecies of Saint Isidore of Seville, but they didn't really understand what Saint Isidore was saying, and therefore their prophecies are false. The Messiah is not going to come and help them, right? So there is a conversation there taking place, not only between Moriscos and Christians, but also, and this is a source that I ended up not including in the book, but that I'm hoping to write an article on this. There was a conversation between Moriscos and Converso Jews that was mediated or that was articulated through this apocalyptic language. And so I have this really interesting case that I've talked about before, where a young Morisco doctor and a young Converso doctor were taken by the Inquisition, and they ended up as cellmates in the Inquisition jails. And the Converso starts telling the Moriscos about these prophecies that he has heard about the coming of the Messiah. And he starts citing these prophecies of Bandarra that are very popular in Portugal at the time. This was a Portuguese Converso. And the Morisco goes to the inquisitors and starts telling the inquisitors all of the things that the Converso is telling him. And he starts citing and reciting the prophecies of Bandarra to the inquisitors. And so he was doing this, of course, because he was trying to gain freedom. And he was thinking that if he told the inquisitors what this Converso was saying, they might be lenient with him. But in any case, what I'm trying to get at is that there is certainly a conversation, and that all three groups, Conversos, Moriscos, and Christians, are very much aware of each other's prophetic narratives, and that there is a conversation between all three groups.
Wonderful. I'm afraid that's all the time that we have for today. I mean, please join me in thanking Maite for her time and for this wonderful presentation and engagement. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for being here. Thanks.